let's put these ideas into practice. So let's say that we have a file called poem.txt, which is a text file that has these 3 lines in it. So 2 roads diverge in a wood, an I, and then a new line. I took the one less traveled by, comma, new line, and that has made all the difference. Notice I'm pointing out these new lines. The reason I'm doing that is because you might not be used to this idea, but when you press the return key or the enter key on your keyboard, what you see in Google Docs or Microsoft Word is that your little cursor will move to the next line. It'll still be flashing, it'll move to the next line, and whatever you type next will show up on the new line, on the next line. The way that this is actually represented in memory, the computer actually has to know where to make those new lines. And so it's not just a visual thing. In the characters that are stored, there's actually a secret special character, /n, which represents a new line in your text file. And so there is actually, if we looked at the contents of the file, there would be a new line character here and a new line character here. Now, this was the canonical code that we saw for how to open a file and read from it. So with open, the name of the file, comma R because we want to read the file only. We're not going to be writing to this file. So with open as F, where F is the name of our file variable. And by the way, F can be anything. It doesn't have to be F. It could be F1, it could be file, it could be France, whatever you want to call it. It's just a variable name. And in our body, we iterate through the lines in the file. So for line in F, print line.upper. So in this case, we're going to want to print out each line uppercase. So if I run that, when I run this code, this is what I get. Kind of a yelling poem. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. 2 things I'll point out here. One, notice what each line here is. So each line was where there is a new line character. So we broke up our line based on new line characters. The other thing that I want you to notice is that there's this empty line in between each of these prints. And that's not what you would have expected. You probably would expect that this would just print one line after another, and that the new line at the end of the string would just cause the next line to appear on the next line. But remember, so when you do print, by default, print adds a new line at the end of whatever you're printing. And so that's why if I did print Alex and then, for example, if I come over here to Replit and I do print Howard and then print Bison, that's why when I run this code, main.py, we see Howard gets printed, and then Bison shows up on a new line. And remember, I showed you in a previous video, if you wanted to have something different at the end other than a new line added, you can override this default argument end and give it an empty string if you want to put something else at the end. So here, Howard and Bison appear on the same line, or you could have a comma, and then the print statement will add a comma at the end of Howard instead of adding a new line. So we get Howard, comma, Bison. So when we look at this, you might wonder, why is it being printed on separate lines like this? Well, that's because when you read in the files from the line, the lines from the file, sorry, the new line character at the end of each line is actually still included in the string. And so that's the equivalent of the actual string is Howard /n, which is this special new line character. And then we additionally add another new line afterwards, because that's what print does by default. So if I run this code here, this is what's happening. If I were to read in, I had a file with the string Howard and the string Bison on 2 separate lines, then the first line would be Howard /n and the second line would be Bison /n. So when I run this, you'll see the same exact thing happens. We have this big space. Again, because by default, print adds a second new line. And if you don't want to do that, you can do end equals quote, quote. which forces Python not to add anything at the end by default to its print. So get Howard and then Bison. So I explained this a little bit already. I'll reiterate. This is the new line character that represents hitting enter on your keyboard, and it gets when you read from the file, the way that a line is defined is anything that ends with a new line character, including that new line character. And so here, if I wanted to actually see, if I want to read all the lines at once, I do f.readLines. If I print them out using the special repr function, you don't need to know too much about it, but it makes it so that instead of printing new lines as an actual new line, we can see what that hidden character is. And so when we print this repr of the lines, we see that there's a new line character at the end of each line, except for the last line, because in this file, no one happened to hit enter at the very end of the file. That can be a little bit annoying. So when you work with files, it's good to know you can use the special string.strip function. And what this does is it removes any spaces or new lines at the start or end of a string. And so here I have just 4 different strings, just the string hello, then a string hello with some spaces at the beginning and end, then a string hello with a new line at the end, and then a string hello with a new line at the beginning, a space, and a new line at the end. All of these, if you call the string the variable name.strip, it returns a new string that doesn't have any spaces or new lines at the beginning or at the end. So all these become hello. And this is handy to use when you're reading from a file and you want to get rid of the annoying new line character that's at the end. You can call that line.strip, or whatever you call your variable for the line. Why don't we take a look at an example? So let's say I made a new, like a new file here, staff.txt. And here I will have our core staff. So Deontay, Dindu, Braden, and Jonathan. So we have these names here. If we go back to our file, let's use the same syntax that we've seen for reading from a file. So with open poem.txt are, so here it will do with open staff.txt, which is the name of our file. And notice, by the way, because this file is in the same directory as our code at the same level, meaning if I type ls over here on the right, I see both my file main.py and staff.txt in the same file here. Whoops. I don't need to provide any path because relative to main.py, this is just staff.txt. I'll show an example where that isn't true in a minute. But with open, the name of the file, and then r as f, then we can read this file line by line. So let's do for line in f, we'll print the line. All done at the very end. So when I run this, you can see we see that same issue that I mentioned to you. So we have Deontay and then a new line, and then Dindu and then a new line, then Braden and a new line, and then Jonathan. Finally all done. And again, if I show you this with that repr, that special repr function, which tells Python not to actually, to show what those hidden characters are that represent some hidden things. One example is new line. We'll see it's actually a string /n/n/n. So if we want to get rid of that, we can use this. We can use this .strip method. So line.strip, and this will get rid of any new lines at the end or at the start of a string, so that the only new line that that gets used is the one that's provided by the print function itself at the end automatically. So now if I run this, I see Deontay, Dindu, Braden, and Jonathan. So now we can go back to and fill in the code that we saw for how to take input from a text file. We can fill in the multiplying code that before was taking input from the terminal. Now we have a file here that has the numbers 3 and 12 in it on new lines, and we can read them in with f.readLine. By the way, I didn't explicitly show this one before. F.readLines reads the whole array, a whole list, sorry, of all of the lines, regardless of how many there are. If you just call f.readLine, it reads one line at a time. And each time that you make that call, f.readLine, it returns the next line. So the first time you call f.readLine, it returns 3. The second time, it returns 12, and so on and so forth until you're out of lines. And so you can use just reading one line at a time like this, as long as you know that the format of your file is that there's always just, in this case, two numbers. And here, reading a line, these lines are always provided as strings. And so if you want to use this as a number and do some sort of math with it, you need to cast it to be an integer. So num1 equals int f.readLine. The product is num1 times num2, and you can print the product out to the terminal, 36. We can even expand this a little further, and we can both read to and write from, read from and write to a text file. And so this reading part is the same. We open the file as f, and we read those numbers in. But then instead of printing just to the terminal, which is what print does by default, we can open a new file. And I need to just correct this here as w, as our presenter view. We open a new file here, path/out.txt, w as f2, and we'll go ahead and print product, and we print it to the file f2. Again, you could call this anything you want. You could call it f again. There's no reason you couldn't. Or you could call it file. You could call it output. All of that would work. And this would create a new file if it doesn't exist, path/out.txt, and would write the number 36 into that file.